tumor excisions, deep-seated tumor excisions, aiming for maximal safe resection, utilizing image-guided system and intraoperative MRI. Also, his expertise in image-guided minimal invasive endoscopic approach in the anterior skull-based procedures like pituitary tumors, excisions, etc. So he's also well known for functional neurosurgery, performing DBS procedures for movement disorder patients. He's very successful in utilizing the IONM techniques, that is utilizing the VEP and also the raw EMG in accurately identifying and placing the DBS electrodes in GPI anatomical structures. So he's a member of Neurological Society of India, International Interop Imaging Society, World Society of Stereotaxy and Functional Neurosurgery with many number of clinical publications. Notable papers are on the utility of VEP in GPI targeted DP procedures and also guidelines on how to manage IONM electrodes artifacts in intraoperative MRI imaging. So a very warm welcome to you, sir. Thank you for accepting our invitation and taking time to teach us on the utility of IONM in infratentorial surgeries. So coming to the second faculty of today's webinar, Dr. Nitin sir, though needs no introduction to the IONM audience in India, but I will share some of his details with all of you. Dr. Nitin Manohar has done his DM in neuroanesthesia from the prestigious institute in NIMHANS and presently working as consultant neuroanesthesia and critical care in Yashoda Hospital, Secunderabad. He is also the program director for fellowships in neuroanesthesia. He is very active author of several publications in national and international journals, especially on IONM and also several books. So Dr. Nitin is also one of the biggest motivators in the country for IONM, as he has given various talks on the topic across India on several platforms. He also has conducted a large number of workshops on IONM, which has been very useful to a lot of anesthetists, surgeons, and technicians across the country. So with this introduction, I extend a warm welcome to Dr. Nitin sir, and thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Praveen.
So before we hear from Dr. Anand sir, today also we invite Dr. Lakshmi, consultant anesthetist, Jain Hospital, Bangalore, for moderating this session. Over to you, ma'am.
Thanks. Yeah, again, warm welcome to all of you. So let's start with the session with the surgeon. Let's hear what the surgeon has to say regarding the anatomical aspects and the clinical relevance, following which we'll hear Dr. Nitin Manohar's talk. After both the sessions, we'll take up questions. So please, all of you, please put in your questions in the chat box. At the end, we'll have the discussion. And please keep your audio on mute mode till we finish. So over to you, Dr. Anand.
Thank you, madam.
Yeah.
Thanks to Medtronic for organizing this webinar, and thanks to my co-speaker, Dr. Nitin. It has been a journey that we have been having over the last few years, where we have been able to proceed with intraoperative neuromonitoring. Other than the basic awake craniotomy and MEP, SSCP, we are trying to learn more. And all these seminars and discussions have been great learning experience for us, including the last meeting that we had. So quickly, we'll go on to the topic, that is intraoperative monitoring in infratentorial surgeries. So the infratentorial compartment is, as the audience is a little mixed audience, it will be a little basic to probably some of the clinicians who are in the audience. Please bear with me. If there are any questions, of course, you could feel free to ask probably towards the end of the session and during the chat session. So this is an overview, as you can see, of the anatomy of all the cranial nerves and the fossa. I have tried to put in what is anterior cranial fossa, this is the middle cranial fossa, and this is the posterior cranial fossa. By posterior cranial fossa, we mean the area below the tent, that is behind the clivus and between the two petrous bones in the suboccipital region. As you can see, the superior most and anterior most is the anterior cranial fossa, which houses our frontal lobes and the olfactory, and then the optic nerves. And the middle cranial fossa has the main 3, 4, 6 eye movement nerves and the 5th nerve. And then all the rest are all in the posterior fossa. And in the supratentorial compartment, we have language areas, motor areas, and sensory areas. Those are the areas that we generally tend to map. And then we try to track stimulation with the MEP and SSCP for the motor and sensory areas. But as you can see, other than the top 5 or 4 cranial nerves, the remaining 8 cranial nerves are in the posterior fossa. And not only that, we also have the motor and sensory pathways that come down through the brainstem. So we have plenty of neural structures. There are no non-eloquent areas. The posterior fossa is tightly packed with eloquent structures. You can see this, the upper part, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, which acts as the transit for the long tracts from the brain to the spinal cord. And then, of course, the cerebellum. Now, this is not just the anatomy. We have the cranial nerves that keep coming out of them and the tracts that pass along them. It's good to remember that the tracts, the most important tracts, especially the pyramidal tracts, are more anteriorly placed, as you can see here in the midbrain, and in the midbrain, the pons, and in the medulla. They're all placed anteriorly. So most of our surgeries that come from posterior, we are not too fussed up about the pyramidal tracts. So unless we have a lateral approach or an anterior approach, most of our surgeries are either posterior or posterolateral, where we enter the gap between the pitras bone and the brainstem and the cerebellum. Now, all the cranial nerve nuclei are in the tegmentum. This is the area of the tegmentum. And in the tegmentum, we have all the cranial nerve nuclei. And in the tectum, that is upper part of the midbrain, not exactly a part of the posterior fossa component, you have the third and second cranial nerve transiting along the colliculus. So most important point here is that the anterior most part is the pyramidal tracts, then you have posteriorly, and then the cranial nerve, and more posteriorly, they traverse along the brainstem and then exit practically all anteriorly and anterolaterally. So we have the cranial nerves here, as you can see, from the second nerve, which is right up there, right down from the level of midbrain, the third nerves, then the sixth nerves, upper pons, fifth, seventh complex, then the lower cranial nerves, all along a line. Now, if you look at it from posterior, the most important areas as the floor of the fourth ventricle, as you can see here, marked out in this red dotted line. So these are the gray matter, that is the nuclei which are present here, which can be on the way for us when we enter into the brainstem through the fourth ventricle. So it's important to know where these nuclei are to preserve these cranial nerves within the brainstem. And when we operate within the gap between the brainstem, cerebellum, and the pitras, we need to know where these nerves are going so that we can monitor them and identify them and preserve them functionally. So this is the MRI. I'm just giving you a view of the MRI in the same sections where we would like to see the nerves. So this is a normal MRI showing at the level of the internal acoustic meatus. Probably this is the commonest clinical situation which arises like in CP angle tumors, where the tumor is exactly in this region between the pons cerebellum angle, the CP angle as it's called, and it arises from the cochlear vestibular nerve over the eighth nerve. So we have the cochlear nerve, the facial nerve in conjunction to this, and these nerves need to be identified and monitored as much as possible. Then in the pons, of course, we'll have the sensory and the motor tracts. If you go a little higher than the level of the exit of the seventh, eighth complex, we have the fifth nerve. The fifth nerve is exiting from anterolateral to the pons and then going into the Meckel's cave. So this is a little higher, maybe a centimeter higher than this level at which you see the internal acoustic meatus. So this becomes an important nerve to preserve, because this is important for both the motor and sensory components of the muscles of mastication and the face. And then if you come down below the internal acoustic meatus, this is at the level of the jugular foramen. We have the lateral exit from the brainstem. You have the exit of the cranial nerves here, that is vagus, that is the ninth glossopharyngeal nerve. And if you go down further, the next cut is where the cervicomedullary junction, you will be able to see the hypoglossal and the spinal accessory. So all these cranial nerves are going to be in between our area of interest, that is between the petrous bone and the cerebellum. So most of these lesions are extra-axially located. So we tend to excise the bone out here, what we call as retromastoid craniectomy, one of the commonest approaches to the posterior fossa. We retract the cerebellum, and then once we enter into the angle, we have these nerves. Either the tumors are arising from the nerves, or we find them in between the nerves, or we have to reach the brain stem, for which we'll enter through the fourth ventricle. So here is a combination of nuclear structures, nerves, and tracts, all of them found in one small area, which could be displaced when there is a tumor, and there lies the difficulty. So I'll just give you some clinical scenarios and examples that we generally face problems, and what exactly as a surgeon we are looking for with intraoperative monitoring. And then Dr. Nitin will take forward all the techniques, and then we'll come back to the discussion. So what are we really requiring information during surgery? So one is localization. We need to know where these tracts are or where these nuclei are, especially if they are in the path of our approach, so that our approach is safe and we don't damage the important structures as we go through to reach the pathology. Next is to maintain the anatomical continuity. So we need information on whether the tracts are continuous, whether the nerves are continuous, as we are operating, whether the anatomical continuity is maintained. We would see it, of course, under microscope, but then we would not know if it is continuous functionally, the functional integrity. So for that, we need definite electrical conduction. So when we know the electrical conduction is happening, at least for the cranial nerves, we know that, yes, that it's really continuous. And of course, for the tracts, for the anatomical continuity, we need all the evoked potentials that need to be firing in a normal way. So what are the methodology that we use? If in the cranial part, that is the supratentorial part, as you know, we mainly rely on mapping for the language areas and the motor and the sensory cortex, and the evoked potentials, the MEPs and SSEPs. And then, of course, we use deep white matter stimulation to identify the tracts as we are nearby. In the posterior fossa, the number of cranial nerves, there being 8. So we use stimulation for the cranial nerves also. We also use corticobulbar evoked potentials, the use of which probably we'll discuss and we'll highlight along with Dr. Nitin. And then we have deep white matter stimulation, just like we do in the cortex, here in the brainstem, to identify the tracts that are passing through and to identify the nuclei. This is very peculiar to posterior fossa. We don't see any cranial nerve nuclei in the supratentorial compartment. And most important is the mechanical stimulation of the motor nerves. Here, this I would stress a lot. Probably I will share it with my experience, how this is more important, because most often we give emphasis on identifying the nerve, but then the disturbance that we cause to the nerve is very important to be measured, and that we get only by myographic or raw EMG stimulation. Then, of course, the newer modalities that are coming up is the various reflexes, because all these direct stimulation, as we know, is not real time. It is only when you stimulate, you get to know whether there is continuity. But if you can monitor a reflex and you can continually stimulate, it is something like evoked potential, but it is just for that nerve, like a trigeminal reflex, a blink reflex, or a masseter reflex, or a brainstem auditory evoked response, which tells us whether that path is intact. So nuclei and their connections to the end organ stimulated and recorded as a reflex is very, very essential. I'm going to give you some clinical examples. And see here, this is the classical acoustic tumor that I mentioned about, that we generally tend to operate in the posterior fossa, probably one of the commonest in the posterior fossa. It is exactly in this junction between the pons and the cerebellum, going into the meatus, what you can see here. So as you know here, we saw in the MRI, we have the 7th, 8th complex that comes out. And thankfully for us, the 7th nerve is usually displaced as per studies anterosuperiorly most of the time. But to the hard luck of the patient and the surgeon's fortune, the nerve may be even seen posteriorly or antero-inferiorly in some cases. We have even had some cases in which the nerve is partially shifted anteriorly and some part of the nerve is posterior. So when we approach this tumor in a retromastoid fashion, the first thing we want to know is whether we are encountering the nerve between us and the tumor. Is the tumor stretched the nerve on its surface, that when we are going to open into the tumor, we should not cut the nerve inadvertently. So previously, before days of intraoperative neuromonitoring, we used to rely only by microscopic anatomy, what looks like a nerve, and then try to preserve the arachnoid and hope that the nerve is preserved. And then the preservation rates used to be nothing more than, say, 60 or 70% at best, anatomical preservation, and functional preservation might have been even worse. But nowadays, we start stimulating even from the beginning. So when we start the surgery, even before we dissect the arachnoid, we start with the stimulation so that we can see where the nerve is. Once we make sure that on the posterior surface, we are not getting any stimulus, then we incise the tumor and start decompressing internally. Now, internally in the tumor cavity, suppose this white area is all black that we have decompressed, and then we have a cavity. One could start stimulating inside the capsule so that the current tends to radiate out and stimulate the nerve. And we tend to know which direction in the capsule is the nerve displaced. It's superior, inferior. So accordingly, when we mobilize the capsule, we can be more careful. The point to note here is that while you are decompressing the nerve, sometimes we can buttonhole along the wall and break into the other side. And there we could have damaged the seventh nerve already. To prevent this, what's most important is the raw EMG. So if the raw EMG is active and it is going on recording in the muscle any firing that happens because of mechanical distraction, the moment you're doing any mechanical traction or any stimulus nearby the nerve, it starts firing. So then you know that you're decompressing the tumor near the nerve, and you can start becoming more gentle, more careful, and try to go outside on the capsule and identify the nerve to preserve the nerve. The next step comes in how gentle we handle the nerve to peel the tumor away from the nerve. In case we are very rough in our handling, which we think we may be very, very soft, but if we are not gentle enough not to damage the nerve mechanically, the nerve can still be anatomically looking preserved, but functionally will be inactive. So the only way, again, we get to know is if the nerve is continuous and it is continuous electrically firing. That again, the myography will get to let us know whether the nerve is getting disturbed. And secondly, if we can have a reflex, a corticobulbar reflex or say blink reflex can be continuously monitored, then we can know that the nerve is intact functionally also. So this is so much of importance. The main surgery of acoustic tumor, as most surgeons in the audience would know, is not about tumor removal. It is about seventh nerve preservation, because it's no more a matter of having a good scan post-op. It is about having a good phase post-op, because the quality of life depends upon nerve preservation, functional preservation, and no point in removing the tumor completely and then leaving the patient with a seventh nerve palsy. And thankfully, we have other modalities of treatment nowadays, like radiosurgery, with which we can, even if we leave behind some tumor along the nerve, we can shoot them with radiation and not let these patients unnecessarily develop a permanent deficit with which they have to live their life all along. So it's very important to trace, identify, and functionally monitor the continuity of the seventh nerve. Not only that, if the tumor is extending superiorly or inferiorly, like here, the tumor is extended superiorly. This, of course, is not an acoustic. This is a classical petroclival meningioma. So you see how the brainstem is pushed out completely here. There is no chance you can identify where the fifth nerve is. And of course, the third, fourth, sixth are also gone through from the brainstem across to the cavernous sinus, crossing this. So this probably is one of the most difficult surgeries to do and one of the most morbid outcomes that a patient can have from, because whatever you do to decompress this tumor, this brainstem damage to the corticospinal tracts or fifth nerve damage, sixth nerve damage, or third and fourth nerve damage becomes inevitable if they are passing through the tumor or if they are stretched so much that they are on the capsule of the tumor thinned out. So monitoring gives a very good control over where we are operating and whether we are in vicinity of the nerve, how to control when to stop decompressing the tumor further, because we know that the cranial nerves are in danger. So if we can expect a decent decompression of this tumor without a disturbance in MEP or SSEP and without any raw fifth nerve firing or a third, fourth, sixth, if we can monitor, then we can say that we have resected maybe 80% of the tumor. The pressure on the brainstem is out. The remaining tumor we don't want to take out to prevent damage to these nerves. We can go ahead with radiation. So this has become the most difficult thing for a surgeon is leaving some tumor behind and realizing that the patient has developed a deficit also. That means you have neither cured the patient of the disease, plus you have given additional.
Hello.
I think Dr. Anand sir
Yeah.
is lost connection.
Okay. So, Dr. Nitin, maybe I'll just try to connect Dr. Anand by the time if you would like to share something. Yeah. Just.
Yeah, I think we'll wait for. I think his internet connection might be an issue.
Oh,
Yeah,
I
he's
think
back.
it's. Yeah. So you can unmute. You are muted.
Is it unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So should I, well, till what point was I audible? The previous? Was I audible here? Hello?
Yeah, you were speaking about the petroclival meningioma, sir, and the brainstem.
Okay, so the petroclival is over. So now when we come down to the lower part, the last sentence I made in the petroclival part was that the most difficult part for a surgeon to accept is that you have left behind a
So,
residual tumor.
Sir, you were
so maybe
sharing.
you have to share your screen. So.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
one second. Yeah. Hmm. Not getting that. Just a second. I may have to reconnect, I think.
You might have an option to share the screen below.
I'm not seeing that option.
1 second, sir.
I think I'll leave the meeting and join again probably, because it's showing me to join the meeting, sign in.
Okay.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, we can hear you, sir.
Yeah, okay. So I need to share the screen again.
Yes, yes.
Yes. So we were at the petroclival and I was making a comment that the most difficult part for a surgeon is to see that we have left behind some tumor to preserve the nerves around it functionally. And then post-operatively, we realize that the patient's function is also lost and the tumor is also left behind. So neither is he cured of the disease and we have inflicted additional problem on him. So that becomes a difficult situation, which probably happens more often than we would like it to. And intraoperative monitoring will help reduce that incidence, because a residual tumor can always be reoperated or tackled by other modalities. Now, this is on the lower end of the spectrum. We saw the acoustic, we saw the superior petroclival region, and that remained the same for clival tumors, etc. This is the lower part. This is the lower part that is along the jugular
So I
foramen.
think yeah, the screen is not yet shared actually.
I'll wait for a while. Last time also it took a little time to come on.
Yeah, okay, but it's not showing. It's not showing the loading sign actually.
Can't
Last time
see
it
the
showed.
screen yet. Yeah.
So probably you can close the PPT and again.
Now
yeah.
it's sharing, sir. So
Yeah.
now
Now
it's
it's sharing?
loading. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
loading now. Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Okay, we can see it now.
You can see it now? Okay.
Yes.
But the audio, you got the audio, right?
Yes, audio is perfectly fine. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you heard the audio. I need not repeat what I said.
No, yeah, we heard the
Yes, sir.
audio. So you can continue from.
So
yeah.
just the lower cranial nerves. Yeah. So this lower cranial nerves here, because of the jugular foramen exit. So here we do have the lower cranial nerves exiting in and around the jugular foramen, and the jugular foramen tumors like this classical glomus jugular tumor. Thankfully, these tumors, even if they affect the lower cranial nerves, are compensated by the opposite side normal functioning nerves. That doesn't mean that we can damage them. Still, we need to take as much time as possible to preserve them as well, so that the morbidity, at least of the post-operative period, is limited. So this area can be very well taken care by radiosurgery these days. So while operating, it is paramount again to make sure that we preserve the 9, 10, 11, and 12 cranial nerves as and when we identify them, and to see that they are intact by using the corticobulbar reflex is possible. If direct identification is possible, then direct stimulation. And of course, the integrity of the medulla, as we can see by the MEP and SSEP tracings. Now comes the next part. The next part is so this is for the corticobulbar. This I have taken from Dr. Delitis' paper. So nicely he shows how by transcranial electrical stimulation, one can find out the integrity of these fibers from 7th, 9th, 10th, and 12th nerves by getting the electrical recording from the muscle. Next. This is in the substance of the brainstem. So I showed the extraaxial tumors, and most of the tumors which are present in the convexity usually does not require any monitoring, just on the cerebellar surface. Now, the brainstem becomes the next most important thing. It could be in the upper brainstem, it could be in the middle of the brainstem, it could be in the lower medullary area. Now, how do we approach these intrinsic brainstem lesions? Through the fourth ventricular floor, or anterolateral approach, or pure lateral approaches? Then we need to know whether the surface is eloquent or not. So it's exactly like mapping in the supratentorial compartment, except that instead of mapping speech or motor, you're going to map cranial nerve nuclei if you're coming from posterior, and if you're coming from lateral, you will be mapping the pyramidal tract. So here is a cavernoma, which is just beneath the fourth ventricular floor. So one needs to identify all the structures in the fourth ventricular floor So the fourth ventricular floor, as you can see here, if it is a pontine tumor, it tends to displace the seventh nerve nucleus inferiorly and laterally. And if it is in the pons, of the pons, lower pons, the facial nerve and the colliculus tends to shift more superiorly and laterally. So this idea of the facial colliculus and the floor of the fourth ventricle gives us the area for us to explore safely without damaging the seventh nerve. Now, if you are in the medullary region, then we are worried about the 12th cranial nerve, the nucleus, which could be displaced ventrally, anteriorly. Most of them, thankfully, are exophytic tumors, so they can be preserved, but you may not have a good plane of cleavage. So you may land up, when you are taking the deeper part of the tumor, damaging the nuclei. So you need to know whether you are going near the margin. So you start thinning down the margin and start stimulating from inside to see how far are you roughly from the nuclei, so that you can identify and preserve the nuclei without giving a damage. And of course, if you're in the cervicomedullary junction, you know that all these cranial nerve nuclei are much higher, and you can probably go ahead and do a decent dissection and resection just like you would do in a spinal cord. Now, this is one of, again, cases taken from Delitus' paper, where he has shown beautifully, he has approached laterally and removed this cavernoma here. And this he has done by doing the mapping of the corticospinal tract on the lateral, anterolateral aspect of the brainstem. So this is, he has given, as he has been tracing from lateral, from midline to lateral, how he was getting corticospinal tract. This is more medial to this tract. This is on the corticospinal tract. This is as he is exiting from the corticospinal tract, and this is the silent area. So this is the area where you could enter and resect that completely. And these are the D waves that he has monitored along with this stimulation, transcranial stimulation from above, with the epidural electrode in the cervical spine, monitoring the D wave continuously, making sure that while you are dissecting this around the corticopyramidal tract is not injured. So this is a very good use of D wave to make sure that you are not damaging any of the structures. So this is in the floor of the fourth ventricle. As I told you, this is probably the most eloquent area that a neurosurgeon gets to operate across. Small areas, you have the facial colliculus here, and you have a lateral window and an inferomedial window which is available without disturbing the seventh nerve. The vagal triangle and the hypoglossal triangle make it practically impossible to go through midline here. And the midline here is all medial longitudinal fasciculus which control the eye movements. So there again, it's impossible to go through. So you need to make a lateral entry here, or an infromedial to the facial colliculus, or superolateral to the facial colliculus. So when you look at the fourth ventricular floor, you don't get to see these lines. And if there is a tumor below, you don't know where these nuclei have got displaced. So the only way you can know is by electrically stimulating and finding out, so that you don't cut across them. And you can make a small window and try to work your way through that as safe as possible without giving a damage. So here again, taken from Dr. Delitus' paper, where he is stimulating the facial colliculus and diagrammatically showing the stimulation, showing the upper and lower half of face being stimulated, and for the lower cranial nerves too, for the vagal and the hypoglossal triangles. Now, apart from tumor, I would leave last with other surgeries where we are trying to utilize use of cranial nerve monitoring, like trigeminal neuralgia, for instance. In case of trigeminal neuralgia, the fifth nerve is obviously compressed by the tumor, by the vessel, and it's atrophic and may be shifted. And sometimes you are not sure whether you have decompressed adequately. You may miss a loop which is more distal, which is not under your vision. Using trigeminal reflex, there has been a standard OPD procedure that has been described to show whether it is symptomatic trigeminal neuralgia or it's a primary idiopathic trigeminal neuralgia. So we had in the last meeting done a glossopharyngeal neuralgia where there was a compression and shown that SSEPs recorded across from the glossopharyngeal area and recorded were showing a decreased latency after the nerve was decompressed. So one could try these trigeminal reflex, one could try various nerve reflexes or potentials which could be recorded in the area supplied by the nerve to know the adequacy, not only the adequacy of the decompression of the vessel, but also the intactness of the nerve itself, that we are not damaging the nerve as we have decompressed the vessel from the nerve. So with this introduction to the anatomy and the various clinical scenarios and what the surgeon expects, I will hand over to Dr. Nitin to take forward the technical and the real practical aspects of monitoring in this difficult area. Thank you so much for your attention. Over to you, Dr. Nitin.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Anand, for explaining the anatomy in brief and telling us what information a surgeon needs during surgery from IONM in great clarity. So over to Dr. Nitin.
Yeah, thank you, madam. Thank you, sir, for that wonderful lecture. I think you made my job easier. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, sir. So I think you have explained the surgical perspective and then also the anatomical part. So that makes my job easier. I'll just focus on the monitoring modalities. So like sir said, this is a very challenging area to monitor, and we have learned through our journey. So so what are the procedures that we commonly use IONM in these areas? Like sir said, CP angle tumors, brainstem lesions for microvascular decompression, some aneurysms like basilar, and then some skull-based lesions, and cellular and supracellular lesions as well. So to classify the monitoring modalities, I'd like to classify it like this. So one is the mapping, where you can map the structures, and the second would be monitoring, to continuously monitor for the integrity of the tracks. And the third will be to do reflex testing. So reflex testing involves to test a reflex arc that involves the cranial nerve or whatever structure is in danger, and we can continuously test it as the surgeon is going on. But the key again is the today's IONM focuses on multimodality IONM. So we want to club all of this together to get the best outcome. So next I'll be dealing with some of the modalities and some of the points about the modalities. So first thing is the electromyography. So this is the basic thing everyone has to and will do this. I'm sure many centers, whoever does CP angle monitoring will do electromyography. So there are, in electromyography, you need to do both free running, that is a raw EMG, and look for nerve irritation, and also do triggered EMG to identify the nerves by means of stimulation. So what are the advantages of doing EMG? So the advantage of doing EMG is that there is no averaging involved, there is no lag time. So the amplitudes are very big, and it gives immediate feedback to the surgeon. So the audio feedback has to be on here. So I emphasize again, EMG is all about audio. So you can look at the screen, but the surgeon also has to listen to the audio, and he has to be aware whenever there is an irritative signal. As for anesthesia, many people ask this question: when you're doing triggered EMG, you don't need to stop muscle relaxant. But when you're doing raw EMG along with triggered EMG, most of the times which we do, you have to stop muscle relaxant, because the raw EMG signals can get affected by muscle relaxant. So for the conventional facial nerve monitoring, we generally follow orbicularis oculi, oris, and mentalis. And we also add fifth nerve along with seventh nerve monitoring. And for fifth nerve, we use the masseter and the temporalis. Also for the lower cranial nerves, you can place the electrodes. As you can see, for the ninth, we place it in the soft palate. Your anesthetist can help you while he intubates. He can place the electrode with the Megill's forceps into the soft palate. Also for the 12th nerve, you can place it in the tongue. For 10th nerve, you can place it either invasively by doing a laryngoscopy in the vocalis, or you can do it outside. You can place it on the cricothyroid, or you can use a 10th nerve monitoring, which comes, an ET tube, which is mounted with a monitoring facility. So that can be used. I'll be showing you that. And also for the 3rd, 4th, 6th, you can place the extraocular muscles. I'll again come back to this in detail. So again, for raw EMG, it's very important to look at raw EMG, because here you are telling the surgeon when he cannot see a nerve. So actually he wants our surgeons want this data always on, and because there's no point in identifying a nerve when it's actually seen to the surgeon. So the important thing is to identify a nerve when the surgeon is not able to see it, and you can tell him that the irritative signal is going on. So the raw EMG can be of two types. That is a short burst or blurs. Here it would be around 100 milliseconds, the duration. And the reasons could be various. It could be due to irrigation, it could be due to cautery, it could be also mechanical when you're doing nerve retraction or you're doing QSA. So these are short and these are called bursts. The next would be the trains. These are long. These could last up to around 30 seconds, and these are called as neurotonic trains. Here you get a continuous stimulation, a continuous sound. So this is something like a motorboat or a popcorn or a bomber aircraft. These are the sounds that the neurotonic trains are. They sound like. And this happens when you have direct nerve compression, when you have direct traction of the nerve, and also during ischemia of the nerve. So these are very important and these are very dangerous. Some examples of. So this was a surgery going on in the CP angle, and you can see the irritative signal. This was a fifth, this was the masseter, I think, and the irritative signals were continuously going on. So we could tell the surgeon that, the cranial nerve is just around there and you need to be careful. And then actually when he went down, he could see the fifth cranial nerve. So that's how important raw EMG is. This is another example for raw EMG. I'm not sure if you can hear the audio, but you can see it is continuous here. This was when the nerve was actually held by mistake. And you can see that there is a continuous irritative signal. And as and when the nerve is left alone, you can see it becomes intermittent and it becomes like a short burst. You can see that it's becoming intermittent now. And then it gradually phases down and then it stops. So this is your short burst. Okay. So many people ask this question: how to reduce identify artifacts, or how to look at raw EMG artifacts, and how to identify that it's an artifact or whether it's an actual irritative signal. The key lies, I think, is to look at the surgical field. And I emphasize is that you should have a screen for yourself when you're doing IONM to see what the surgeon is doing. And then you can correlate, whenever he's doing a QSA or whenever he's doing some instrumentation there and you find the artifact, you can correlate it beautifully. So always look at the surgical screen, have a surgical screen pointed towards the IONM monitoring person. That is very important. The other important thing is to get good baseline. So at the baseline itself, check for your raw EMG, whether it's clean, it should be straight, there should not be any electrical noise, because later you get confused whether it's because of the artifacts or because of the actual nerve irritation. And the most important thing, as I said, is to have the audio feedback always on. So this is a triggered EMG. Here you can see we are using a bipolar stimulator, and then you get the triggered EMG responses. This was a soft palate for the 9th. This was for the 7th cranial nerve. Okay, the oris oculi and the mentalis. And this is the trapezius for the 11th. So this is how you can do triggered EMG. The audio should be always on. So one thing which I think have to move on is we are using needle electrodes to place in these muscle, for doing cranial nerve monitoring. I think it's time to move on to hook electrodes. This is what Professor Delitis emphasizes on. So he says you have to use hook electrodes. This is a small, wire hooked onto a needle, and then you can push it into the muscle belly. And these hook electrodes, they say the artifact reduction and the identification of cranial nerve irritative signals is very, specific, and it's very good with these hook wires. These are the stimulation parameters that Professor Delitis recommends in his paper. Generally, we use monopolar to begin with. That's what we do in our institute. We use monopolar to begin with. We try to find the nerve or find the structures. And then when we actually know where the nerves lie, then we use a bipolar. Most important thing is when you're using a bipolar, try to use a concentric bipolar or a cranial nerve bipolar, and should not use the 5 mm separated bipolar that you use for cortical mapping, because you can stimulate the distal nerve and then get a false normal recording when you have actually caused harm to the cranial nerve. So it's important to use a concentric bipolar. And for identification of cranial nerve, we start higher up with around 5 milliamperes and then come lower. And if you get a positive stimulation with 0.5 milliamperes, that means you're directly on the nerve. The problem with this EMG monitoring is that everybody, I think most of the people who do INM do this, is that even if 10 to 20% of the nerve fibers are intact, you get a triggered EMG response. So the patient will wake up with a deficit even though you have got a proper triggered EMG response. That's where the whole crux of the problem lies. So we need to advance into other modalities. So let's start from here. So one thing is how to differentiate the 5th and 7th cranial nerve EMG. So many people have these issues, even I had issues. So the surgeon will ask you whether this is a 5th cranial nerve or the 7th cranial nerve. Very confusing because both look very similar and they act very similar. So the key is to look at the amplitudes and to look at the latency. So true facial nerve latency will be late. It will be around 6 to 8 milliseconds, and the true latency of the fifth nerve, trigeminal nerve, will be around 3 to 4 milliseconds. So look at the latency and also look at the amplitude. So wherever you get the biggest amplitude, you can identify the true cranial nerve. So it's very sometimes it becomes difficult to identify the fifth and seventh cranial nerve by doing triggered EMG. This was what the 10th cranial nerve monitoring that I was mentioning. With the endotracheal tube, here comes a sensor. This can be placed in between the vocal cords, and then whenever a stimulation is positive, you can see the vocal cord twitching, and then this can be recorded on the EMG trace. But sometimes this becomes a problem. Like in our center, we do intraoperative MRI, so these can't be taken into the intraoperative MRI. So we have moved on away from this, and we do cricothyroid monitoring. So your you can identify the thyroid cartilage just below it. In between the cricoid and the thyroid is your cricothyroid. You can place your needle electrodes there and effectively monitor 10th nerve. Or you can ask your anesthetist to while doing his endotracheal intubation itself, he can look at the vocal cords and then place the needle electrodes laterally into the vocalis muscle. So this is one thing which your anesthetist can help you while doing 10th cranial nerve if you don't have an endotracheal tube, 10th nerve specific endotracheal tube. Coming to the third, fourth, sixth, I think many people have lots of doubt on this, how to do it. It's very difficult. Initially, you will be very afraid to put the electrodes into the, the extraocular muscles around the eye. You'll feel afraid whether you'll go into the eyeball. So what I recommend is you use ultrasound guidance. Your anesthetist will be able to help you with ultrasound guidance. You will be able to identify the globe, and you can be outside the globe, and you can place the needle electrodes into the belly. Initially, if you're working in a multi-speciality hospital like we do, we have an ophthalmologist around in the OT. We generally call him for this placement. He comes and he can guide you as to where the electrodes have to be placed. For true third, fourth, sixth nerve monitoring, for the sixth, somebody asked this, I think. For the sixth, you need to place in the lateral rectus. Okay. For the third, we use the medial rectus. Okay. And for the trochlear nerve or the fourth nerve, we use the superior oblique. Okay. So this placement is very difficult. You find it very difficult. So what we are now moved on to is the electrooculography. So this is a beautiful paper. This is one done by one of our colleagues, neuroanesthetist from NIMHANS, Dr. Suparna and Dr. Veena. So what they have done is they don't place these electrodes into the muscle belly. What they do is they just place 4 electrode needles in the upper, lower, and in the medial and lateral part of the eyeball. Okay, outside the eyeball. So one in the medial canthus, one in the lateral canthus, one above the globe, and one below the globe. And then whenever you do triggered EMG, you get specific, responses like this because of the deviation of the eyeball. So you can see this is a third cranial nerve. You get horizontal downward deviation. So for the sixth cranial nerve, you can get an upward deflection on the horizontal. And likewise, for the fourth cranial nerve, you get a vertical deflection. Okay, you get a deflection on the vertical axis. So you just need to place 4 needle electrodes around the eye, medial, lateral for the horizontal, vertical you place above and below the globe. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, sir. Yeah, we can.
Okay. So this is their paper where they have done it for 11 cases. These are all the cases where they have used skull-based lesions, where they have used this extraocular muscle monitoring. And they have said that in all the surgeries, they were able to identify the cranial nerves exactly. So the identification is very, very key. And then it also correlates with good outcomes. That is what they have mentioned in their paper. It's very easy to do. I think so from 3, 4, 6, you can just do this electrooculography. This paper is available online. And I think Ankit can share all the papers in the end to all the audience, whoever wants this. So this is an effective technique of doing third, fourth, sixth cranial nerve monitoring. Next is for the second cranial nerve. So for the optic, we do visual evoked potentials. Generally, we use it for the cellular lesions, for the supracellular lesions, and for the skull-based lesions. So the pathway is the retina is stimulated. Once the retina is stimulated, the impulse goes to the optic nerve, and then you have a chiasm. So the chiasm, at the chiasm level, you have a mix match from the medial fibers. So the medial fibers generally crisscross, and then go on into the optic tract, and then into the lateral geniculate body, and finally into the optic radiation and into the occipital cortex. So this is the track. This is the whole pathway of the visual pathway. You can do VEP monitoring from orbital tumors to cellular lesions where you're around the chiasm, to behind when you're around the optic tract. So the implications go so on. So what we use currently is the eye goggles for stimulation. This is your goggles. It looks like your swimming goggles where you use for for your when you do your swimming. So it has LED bulbs inside. Problem with this is it is a little bulky. So the Japanese have innovated this, and they have used scleral claps. It comes like a coin which can be just placed on the eye. So we still don't have it in India. So once we have that, I think the VEP will become more easier to do. So to give one example, this is a skull-based lesion where you can see this is the optic nerve. Okay, this is just at the base of the tumor, and when you're doing the subfrontal approach and when you're doing the tumor out here, you can injure the optic nerve. So this was one case where we did VEP monitoring. So we placed electrodes in the O1, O2, and OZ, and then for reference we took FZ or CZ you can take. The responses generally will be around the N75 P100 responses. So you can see this is the response here. Okay, that is the latency of the typical VEP waveform. So like I said, the problem with VEP is that these bulky goggles can come off the eyes during the skull flap resection and they can slip off. So what we have done in our institute is with VEP, we also do ERG monitoring. So this makes sure that the retinal stimulation is intact. That means that the goggles are still on the eye. So intraoperatively, if you have a drop in signal, you can see the ERG and you can make out whether the retinal stimulation is going on or the lack of response or the signal drop is because of the goggle slipping down. So this is the ERG response here. You can see in this typical ERG recording from the right eye, we are stimulating. This is the ERG response. So the left is flat, okay? And then you can get bilateral. So the VEP is always bilateral. So whenever you stimulate even one eye, you get responses from both the occipital left and right electrodes. So this is the N75 P100 response. Again, what you see for is the latency and amplitude here. The red one is the baseline, and this green one is the recorded responses, and this white one is the ongoing average. So many people have the notion that VEP is very difficult to do intraoperatively and anesthetic sensitivity is very high, but it is not actually, because with effective TIVA techniques that we have now, we can do good VEP monitoring. So propofol TIVAs or Dexmed or whatever we use is very good to get good VEP recordings, and we have been successfully able to do VEP recordings in our institute for a number of cases. The most important thing is the baseline acquisition. Many times we fail to get VEP also. So be truthful. I think at the start itself, if you don't get a good baseline, there is no point in continuing further. And so baseline acquisition is very important before the surgery starts. So that is one thing. And the problem again is with laterality. Like I said, even if you're interested in one optic nerve, even the responses are always bilateral. So the laterality is the big issue in VEP monitoring. So what we follow in our institute is we stimulate both eyes first, get the responses, then we stimulate the non-endangered eye, and then we stimulate the endangered eye throughout the critical step of surgery. So during this phase, if there is a drop in amplitude or increase in latency, we check the opposite eye, that is a non-endangered optic nerve, and see if the responses are still intact. So the stimulation from the opposite optic nerve will act as the control here. So this is what we follow in our institute. These are the stimulation parameters that we use: 80 to 100% of light intensity, low frequency 5 millisecond single pulses, and sweeps around 100 for averaging, and sensitivity of 2 microvolts. For alarm criteria, we use the typical 50% decrease in amplitude and a 10% increase in latency. But for warning, we use a two-step criteria, because many times this VEP, it's difficult to keep getting good VEP waveform. Sometimes you might get a technical issue. So what we do is we follow a two-step warning criteria. So we get a VEP waveform. If there is a drop, we tell the surgeon that there is a first signal drop, and then we do another VEP, get an averaging, get a signal again, and then if there is again a drop, then we inform the surgeon that there is a true drop. So we follow two-step warning criteria for VEP. It's very difficult to do VEP. Initially, you will face difficulties, you'll face challenges, but I think we can and we need to start doing VEP more and more, and we can now, at least we can know with good TIVA techniques and good stimulation with LED goggles, we can do intraoperative VEP very effectively. So summary of all the cranial nerves, I think I've explained all the cranial nerves and where the electrodes need to place. I'm not going into detail of this. So the next would be for the 8th cranial nerve, we need to do brainstem evoked responses, or the BERA. So the pathway is E. coli MA, or that is a mnemonic that we use: 8th cranial nerve, cochlear nucleus, superior olivary complex, lateral lemniscus, inferior colliculus, lateral geniculate body, auditory radiation. Don't remember this, it's okay. Just remember you get 7 waveforms. Okay, so you get 7 waves, and The first three, that is the 1, 2, 3 are from the lower brainstem. Okay. The 4 and 5 are from the upper brainstem. And then the 6 and 7 are cortical responses. So 1 to 5 is your most important, that is from the brainstem. That is the information that you get from the brainstem. So normally the 1, 3 and 5 are the positive peaks. Okay. And the most prominent peak will be the 4-5 complex or the 5. So generally what we look at is the 5. Okay. You keep looking for amplitude and latency change with the fifth wave. So for stimulation, we use auditory clicks and we use these kind of ear plugs which go into the ear and you can keep stimulating. Surgeries where we use brainstem auditory work potentials are whenever there is a brainstem retraction required. So surgeries like brainstem lesions, MVD, cerebellar lesions, even in CP angles when there is brainstem involvement, you can use BERA. So this is a typical BERA that has been recorded. You can see the fifth wave here and it is nicely recorded here, and this is the baseline and this is the ongoing recording. For stimulation, we use click stimulation with 80 to 100 decibels of intensity. Okay. The important thing is you can give white noise also in the opposite ear for contralateral masking, and you can give white noise and you can stimulate only the ear of interest if you have hearing preserved. So what do we look at? I told you this is the most important thing. You look at the fifth wave. There are 3 peaks, 1, 3 and 5. And this is this already I've explained to you. So we look at the latency and amplitude of fifth wave. You can also look at interpeak latency of 1 and 3, between 1 and 5 and 3 and 5. This gives you some important information as to the brainstem integrity. For CP angle with preserved hearing, there are some cases with CP angle where you can get them early when there is no sensory neural hearing loss. You can still preserve hearing by looking at the wave 1 and 2 in the BERA. Okay, so you can do continuous 1 and 2 monitoring for looking at the cochlear nerve function, and also look at the fifth wave and look for any delay in more than 1 millisecond. So they say a latency delay of more than 1 millisecond delay in fifth wave will have definite hearing. So if it is less than 4 milliseconds of latency change, it's still okay. 4 to 1 is gray area. More than 1 millisecond delay is definitely going to cause hearing loss. So you can look for hearing preservation also in with BERA while doing CP angle surgeries. So there are some myths about BERA which I would like to break here. One thing is, in a CP angle surgery, if there is a sensory neural hearing loss on the same side, can you still do BERA monitoring? Yes, you can do BERA monitoring for brainstem function. What you need to do is you need to stimulate the opposite ear, and you can, because the responses get bilateral, you can still keep looking at the BERA and then look for brainstem integrity. So that is one myth. The second myth is effect of anesthesia on BERA. There is absolutely very little effect on or minimal or the BERA is very resistant to anesthetic. So you get good BERA recordings in whatever anesthesia you give. So that is one thing. And some people feel it is too much looking into there. So there are 7 waves. We need to keep looking at it. It is not that difficult. Actually, if you keep doing it, you'll get a hang of it. And BERA is actually a simple modality to do. Next, until now we were looking at the cranial nerve. So now we'll move on to the monitoring modalities. Till now we were looking at mapping. So now we'll go on to the monitoring modalities. So one important thing is, like Anand sir said, the corticobulbar MEPs. So these are very, very important because this helps you to keep stimulating and keep recording for the corticobulbar MEP, and you can tell the surgeon as to where the functional tracks are, there is integrity or not. So what we follow here in corticobulbar MEPs, we give a train first, and then we give an interstimulus interval, and then we give a single or a 1 or 2 impulses again, and then we look for responses. Generally, once the train, you get responses from the train, and then you don't have responses after the second stimulus, after the interval. So that is how you differentiate between central responses and peripheral responses. So the corticobulbar MEPs, you can use C4CZ unilateral stimulation, that is C4CZ, or C3CZ stimulation. Generally, current used is between 50 to 150 milliamperes, and the interstimulus interval should be around 90 milliseconds. There is something innovative in this. You can use quadripolar linked montage stimulation also. This is something like you have 2 Corkscrews electrodes which is connected to 1 port. So you can use C3, C5 together, which goes into 1 port. So you can use C3 plus C5 and then C4 plus C6 to do lateral stimulation, and this is called as quadripolar linked montage. These are also useful to do corticobulbar MEPs. This is very important information because the surgeon, even though he is doing stimulation mapping, he might ask you to check for integrity, and this helps us to check for this integrity. So a lot of questions, I think in previous sessions also I heard that what are the control for high cervical spine. Suppose you're doing work in the C1 and C2. So what is the control? So corticobulbar MEPs are your control then. So you can do control monitoring with corticobulbar MEPs and continue to do C1, C2 or high cervical cases. Corticofacial MEPs, this is nothing but the same concept, put electrodes into the facial muscles and then record from cortical stimulation from the opposite side and keep looking for facial MEPs. So this is corticofacial MEPs. So this paper I would like to emphasize that has stressed on the corticofacial MEPs. What they have said is the amplitude reduction in the corticofacial MEPs correlates much better than doing only EMG monitoring. So the amplitude reduction by more than 30% is what they have kept as an alarm criteria. And they have found very good correlation between post-operative function. The problem with CP angle is many times we do raw EMG, triggered EMG, but still patients wake up with deficits. So if you do corticofacial MEPs, you can break this and you can do, the outcomes will be much better. Hypoglossal MEPs, that is the same thing, again put electrode into the tongue and do hypoglossal MEPs. So this also has been tried and it is very effective for lower cranial nerve monitoring. So this is the blink reflex. Now, till now we were doing monitoring. Now we'll move on to the reflexes. So the blink reflex is one reflex which is catching a lot of attention now intraoperatively also. So here what we do is we stimulate the supraorbital nerve and then we record responses from the oculi. So that this reflex involves the fifth, afferents from the fifth and then efferents from the seventh. So you can do continuous blink reflex monitoring when you are doing tumor resection involved around the facial or the the CP angle on these kind of tumors. So you get a R1 response, and this we have tried in our institute in few cases. We have been successful. These are the stimulation parameters. I think I'll not go into detail of this. This is available in the paper. Ankit will share with all of you. You can have a look at that. So our anesthesia regimen for all this intraoperative monitoring is always, because when we do IONM, we do multimodal monitoring. So we follow zero MAC anesthesia. We follow propofol TIVA, which is titrated to a BIS or an entropy or an EEG monitor. We also use dexmedetomidine for hemodynamic stability, and we also use opioids freely. So there is no necessity to stop this. One point I would like to stress is many of us do monitoring, but we don't see the patients preoperatively. So we have to do preoperative assessment of the patient as to what deficits the patients have. This will help us to plan the monitoring better and to understand what we can achieve intraoperatively. Second thing is to have a huddle around the surgeons and talk to them as to what they expect during the surgery. So before the surgery, you have to talk with the team and to ask them what they are thinking about and what monitoring modalities they want. So the monitoring planning becomes better. Also, we have to make it a habit to talk to the patients also, to explain to the patients what we are trying to do, and we have to make our presence felt so that they also get confidence and they know what we are doing. So this is, I think, is very important. When I think most of us don't do this, we have to start doing this. So again, with the checklist, I think all this has been discussed previously. You have to have a good checklist. You have to look at other hemodynamic, metabolic, technical factors, and then finally give the surgical warning to the surgeon. So you have to have a good checklist. So some things about anesthesia I wanted to, because I'm a neuroanesthetist, I wanted to emphasize this. We sometimes have an issue that the entropy and BIS come off during the skull flap resection. Okay, so when they're doing the skull flap elevation, the BIS and entropy sensors come off from the forehead. So you can do EEG monitoring and you can do SCF monitoring. So this is the SCF monitoring continuously going on. And this is your EEG, this is called the signature of your EEG, what anesthesia you're giving. Everybody will have a specific signature. So this SCF monitoring you can use to monitor your depth also. This number, if you multiply it by 3, the SCF, you can get a number which is probably going to be equal to your entropy or BIS. So you can correlate your depth monitoring and titrate your anesthetics with this. One more problem which most of us face is while placing the BIS and entropy, generally the forehead is not free. The surgeons want to raise the flap up to the eyebrow. So what you can do is you can place the BIS electrodes ulta like this. And this has been validated, mind you. This is a paper to validate it. You can go and look back into the reference. So you can place it around back like this. Same way, entropy also, you can place it back down, and you can do still depth monitoring when you have problems around the forehead. The universal problem for anesthetic is bite blocks. So this is a problem which we keep discussing and keep talking about. So we used to do bite block monitoring with 2 cc syringes, with the plunger out and rolled with gauze pieces bilaterally and keeping the tube in the center. But this is a little hard. We want something which is soft. This is a silicone bite block which I was lucky to have, to get it, and it was very, very effective. So this is currently not available in India. And I think some work is going on manufacturing of this. We might be able to get a good byte block in the future. Alternatively, you can look in Amazon, you can look for dental byte blocks. So these are the dental byte blocks which are available at very cheap price. They come with various sizes. You can use them also as byte blocks. This material is a little hard though, but it is very effective in protecting the tongue. We have used it a lot in our center also. Okay, so until now we were talking about anesthesia, about the modalities available now. So this was one case which we were challenged with. This was a CP angle tumor. This was a huge tumor, and this was probably a trigeminal schwannoma. So we were thinking, what we can do in this case. So apart from the raw and triggered EMG of the cranial nerves, corticobulbar MEP, transcranial MEP, and SSEP for tract monitoring, which go through the brainstem, BERA, and Brinkley reflex, we also wanted to monitor the fifth nerve. So this is what we did. So we did trigeminal SSEP. So here what you use is you use sticker electrodes around the trigeminal sensory distribution and then record responses from the opposite cortex. Okay, so these are the trigeminal SSEP recordings which we got, and we were able to continuously monitor for the sensory component of trigeminal. It's very important because trigeminal nerve we always do only motor monitoring. We do temporalis, we do masseter, but 80% of the tumor of the nerve I think has sensory component. So we don't look at the sensory aspect. So we can do trigeminal SSEP also intraoperatively. This is one thing which I wanted to emphasize. And again, for long tract, which go through the, the corticospinal tract and the ascending sensory tracts, we can do SSEP and MEP continuously. But one thing which I think we have to start doing is also doing D-wave monitoring for MEP. So we can do epidural or percutaneous D-wave placement. Your anesthetist can place it very easily. It is after all, it's an epidural catheter. So you can place it epidurally and you can do continuous D-wave monitoring in cases where you want epidural D-wave. So the specificity goes up very high. So I think this we are not doing yet. We need to do this in the future. So for CP angle, for a typical CP angle, this is the protocol that we follow. You do cranial nerve monitoring of facial, trigeminal, lower cranial nerves, raw and triggered EMG. Also look for corticobulbar MEPs and also add a blink reflex. If you can do it, it gives very important information of the fifth and seventh integrity. So this again is an interesting case, which was a brainstem tumor. Okay, so this case, what we did was, apart from the raw triggered EMG, the brainstem monitoring, apart from all this with the BERA, we also did third, fourth, sixth cranial nerve, as you can see in this. So we have placed the extraocular muscles, and also what we did was we used corticospinal tract mapping. Okay, so this was what Anand sir was saying. We used a monopolar suction stimulator. This is the same suction stimulator that we use for subcortical mapping. So we use this in our brainstem work also when we want to identify the corticospinal tracts. So you can do corticospinal tract monitoring with this suction stimulator. This is another interesting case which we have published in Neurology India. So what here we did was, Anand sir was mentioning, this was an MVD case of glossopharyngeal neuralgia. So apart from identifying raw EMG, triggered EMG, and identifying the cranial nerves, we did SSEP of the glossopharyngeal nerve. So what we did was we stimulated the glossopharyngeal nerve directly with a bipolar stimulator, distal to the compression. And then as the compression was going on, we looked for latency and amplitude of the glossopharyngeal SSEP, which was monitored from the cortex. So what we observed was pre-decompression, post-decompression, there was a change in latency of around 15%, I think. So there was a difference in latency, and we can effectively tell the decompression was successful or effective by looking at SSEP. So this was one paper. This is a one-off case. We plan to do more of such SSEP from the cranial nerves also and look for decompression after this kind of MVD cases to look for effective decompression. This is another interesting case about visual evoked potentials. Like what we have done is in a DBS case for dystonia, where the target is GPI. So here what we did was we did a VEP guided DBS. So what we have done is we have initially placed the goggles. We have done a baseline VEP recording. We titrated our anesthesia so that the VEP recording come effectively. Then what we did was we did the DBS placement. Okay, the DBS placement according to the navigation and the protocol. And once the DBS placement was done, we stimulated through the DBS electrode, and this is called as optic tract stimulated VEP. The recording is again from the occipital cortex. So what we do is from the DBS electrode, we stimulate the tracts, and the GPI is actually just placed just beside the optic tract. So we look for VP amplitudes. Wherever we get maximal amplitude, 1 millimeter away from that site is your GPI. So that is the dictum. We have published this in Neurology India. You can have a look at the paper and understand how we did this. Very challenging. Also, we look at corticospinal tract monitoring. So this is the optic tract stimulated VEP, where we look for maximal amplitude, and also we look for side effects of the corticospinal tract. Okay. So this is how we can do VEP guided DBS placement. This is a postoperative scan, CT and the MRI. This is an intraoperative MRI actually, where we placed the electrode and we confirmed the electrode placement intraoperatively, which was exactly on the GPI. Again, in tumors like clival lesions, where this lesion you can see is encasing the carotid. So you want to do carotid monitoring here. So the carotid is under danger, it has to be decompressed. So what we do in such cases, we do ischemia monitoring. So what we do is bilateral EEG, okay, bilateral ACF monitoring. Okay, so whichever side is endangered, the other side would be the control, the same side would be the area of interest. You look at the EEG slowing and also for the drop in SCF number. Okay, you can, this is EEG. So EEG records only from the gray matter. So if you want to be more highly specific, you have to do SSEP, which monitors the gray matter plus the white matter. So the SSEP drop in amplitude will definitely tell you that the ischemia is going on. So the 50% drop in amplitude in SSEP waveforms will tell you that ischemia is at a dangerous level, and you need to look back and you need to protect. So again, for example, just for completion sake, I've put this MC aneurysm. So this is an MC aneurysm because the MCA supplies the area of lateral hemisphere where the upper limb is involved. We do upper limb SSEP bilaterally. The side of interest and the opposite side will be the control. Do EEG plus SSEP monitoring. Even when the EEG starts slowing, the SSEP is intact, you can continue to keep your temporary clip. So the temporary clip has to be removed when the amplitude of the SSEP drops by 50%. So that is when you actually tell the surgeon that ischemia is very, at the level where you need to remove the temporary clip. So you can actually tell the surgeon, because temporary clip time is very subjective. Each person's contralateral circulation, all those will be, you can monitor and tell when to remove the temporary clip. So it is very useful in vascular work. You can use this in carotid endarterectomy also, when you can tell the surgeon when to place a shunt. So you can use it for carotid endarterectomies also. For aneurysms around the ACA, we use lower limb SSEP. For MCA, we use upper limb SSEP. And for basilar top aneurysm, that is a posterior circulation aneurysm, you can use BERA also along with SSEP. And you can do a post clipping or a post, securing the aneurysm post coiling. You can do an MEP to look for responses. This helps to identify whether the clip has actually caught a perforator and then you have, caused some damage. So you can, after clipping, you can do an MEP response and look at whether the MEP responses are good. So this is how IONM is useful in vascular work also. So apart from this, in our institute, we have intraoperative MRI. This makes our job more challenging. So we do intraoperative MRI between the surgery, where we take the patients into the MRI, do a scan, come back. So the challenge is to keep the IONM electrodes while doing the MRI. So we have our institute protocols, how we protect the electrodes, how we prevent burns, So we have written a paper on this also. You can have a look. We can share it with you. So the point is, there is no point after coming out from intraoperative MRI and not continuing with IONM. So if you're doing a CP angle, if you're targeting facial nerve preservation, and if you find a residue in the intraoperative MRI, you come out, you still have to continue to do facial nerve monitoring when the tumor resection is again going to be done after the intraoperative MRI. So you need to keep the IONM electrodes. It's very challenging, but we have made protocols in our institute where how we can do intraoperative MRI with IONM. And I think many centers will come up with IMRI in the future. So we need to understand how to do it together. So this is one paper which we have written from our institute, where electrodes also cause artifacts. So we reduce the number of electrodes for SSEP MEP monitoring. What we have done is we place only 3 electrodes. We do C3, C4 dash placement. We use them as MEP stimulators, also as SSEP recorders. So the same electrode. So we reduce the number of electrode placements on the scalp, so that we get less number of artifacts in the images in the intraoperative MRI. So coming on to the advanced modalities, these are still in experimental stage. One of them is the laryngeal adductor reflex. So here what we do is we stimulate one part of the vocal cord on one side. We record responses from the opposite side. This information is vital because some tumors in the brainstem, we want to know whether the patient can be extubated, whether the patient will have cough, whether the patient will have vocal cord mobility. So you don't need to wait until the end of surgery. You can do laryngeal adductor reflex. So this is being done in some centers, but it's still in the experimental stage. I think we need to learn more and more about this, but this will be very vital information for lower cranial nerve reflex monitoring. Masseter reflex is also one such reflex where the mandibular nerve is stimulated just below the zygomatic arch, and then you can record from the temporalis and the masseter. This again, these are the stimulation parameters and how they do it. It's mentioned in the paper which I'll be sharing with you, and you can go through this. Still in the experimental stage, we have not been successful in doing this until now. So the summary is, apart from mapping of cranial nerve, that is raw EMG and triggered EMG, you can also map the corticospinal tract in the brainstem. For monitoring, you can do corticospinal tract monitoring with MEP. You can do corticofacial MEP. You can do corticobulbar MEP. For sensory tracts, you can do limb SSCPs like we do generally. You can also do cranial nerve SSCP, glossopharyngeal SSCP, trigeminal SSCP to add with. And also for brainstem, you can do BERA, brainstem auditory evoke responses. The reflexes which can be done intraoperatively are blink reflex, and what are in the experimental stage still are the laryngeal adductor reflex and the masseter reflex. These are the surgeries which we commonly do in this region, and these are the suggested modalities. I think we have discussed most of it, so I'm not going to detail of this slide. This is our team where we work in Yashoda hospitals, and it's been a journey for us. We have worked together for 4 years now. With Anand sir being our leader, we have learned through our journey. We have started from simpler modalities and gone through to do advanced modalities in our institute. We have had a beautiful learning experience as a team. So this is Professor Vedran Delitis. This is the man we are talking about. So this is the meeting last year we held in our institute. Every year we have a users meet of all the IONM users, and everyone should attend this meeting once a year. Here is not a society, not an official conference. We just share information, present what work we are doing, and learn from each other. Professor Delitis has been kind enough to come every year, 3 times. Last year also he was in Hyderabad with us, and he shares a lot of information and helps us, to do our monitoring better and teaches us. So this was the last year's meeting. This is the paper that I was talking about. This is the paper which is in Journal Clinical Neurophysiology, and Vedran Delitis is the name that you need to search and read about. He has done a lot of work on brainstem and all this modalities, and I'm hopeful that next year also, if all this corona and this COVID thing stops, he will be with us to share more knowledge with us. So also one recent textbook that chapter we have written is the Atlas of Neuro-Oncology from SGPGI, and we have written a chapter on how to approach the surgeons who are listening. Maybe you can, we have discussed various tumors and what are the approaches with the IONM also, how to approach these tumors in this atlas. It will be soon available, I think, on Amazon. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Nitin, for the very detailed talk and sharing your very innovative work. Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll quickly move on to questions. There are quite a lot of questions. So the first one is, what is the clinical importance of stimulation of cranial nerve nuclei in the brainstem?
I think Dr. Anand should take this. Importance of cranial nerve. Sorry.
Yeah, cranial nerve nuclei I had shown, especially in the trans-fourth ventricular route to the brainstem. All the nuclei are totally dispersed in that region, starting from the superior colliculus, inferior colliculus posteriorly. Then we have the facial colliculus. Then we have the vagal and hypoglossal triangles. All these areas have to be delineated to identify the safe zones. The safe zones are all spread around these important nuclei, which are present in the floor of the fourth ventricle. So mapping the floor of the fourth ventricle is as important as mapping the language area in the supracortical region to preserve all of them.
So thanks, sir. So there is one more question for you. Is when do you feel the need for monitoring sensory component of the mixed cranial nerves? I think Dr. Nitin showed us the monitoring of 5th and 9th cranial nerve sensory component.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's more like mixed nerves. If you can monitor both components, it is good, so that you're preserving both of the components, because in the 5th nerve, suppose, as he said, if you are monitoring only for the motor component, and patient lands up with a V1 hyposteria post-op, and God forbid he has a 7th nerve palsy, then it's going to be disastrous. So if you want to monitor whichever component is monitorable, it is good to monitor both the components if they are available. One cannot play a surrogate for the other.
Yeah.
Both are independent and both have to be preserved separately.
Okay. Thanks, sir. So a few more questions to Dr. Nitin. If there is a partial facial palsy, do we need to give the increased strength of stimulus to get a response?
If there is a
Partial facial palsy, like if a patient has deficits already present because of the tumor, so how do we monitor that?
I think it's the same approach because you're identifying the cranial nerve. I don't think it will change because even if a patient has functional deficit, the anatomical integrity is intact. It's the same principle. You start with a 5 milliampere current and then come down to 0.5. And then if you hit the nerve, you'll actually get a good response for triggered EMG. Obviously, the corticobulbar and the other responses will be diminished. You have to look at the baseline and then compare the amplitudes later with the baseline. So that is how we approach. I think for patients who are already having deficits, definitely for corticobulbar MEPs, you need to, corticofacial MEPs, you need to increase the current. But for triggered EMG, it doesn't change much.
Yeah. Okay. So the other question is, can we do blink reflex intraoperatively and technical details? I think you're sharing the paper on blink reflex at the end of the session. Yeah.
Yeah. So I can, if my screen is being shared, you can also have a look at this. This is the stimulation parameters, what has been suggested by Professor Delitis again. So this is his work. So this is what I think we can share the paper because.
Okay, sure. And for the spontaneous EMGs, if they are showing burst pattern or whatever pattern, so what is the time that you wait before you alert a surgeon?
I think the audio feedback is already on, so it's never off. So the surgeon, I've given a lot of false alarms also. I think it's better to give a false alarm than to not give an alarm. And that is where we need to be truthful and we need to be, that's the key I feel. So even if it's a false alarm, you look at, discuss with the surgeon. The surgeon will sometimes tell you, I'm not doing anything. It's a false thing. So I think, and looking at the surgical field also really helps. So I think I have started looking at what Dr. Anand is doing, and I can expect. So whenever he's manipulating there, if there is a artifact, the irritation there, I can tell him that probably you are there. Sometimes even with cautery, even with irrigation, you get these audio stimulus. So you need to correlate. You need to look in carefully. That's what I think. You need to be holistic. Not only looking at the IONM screen, you need to look at the surgical field also.
Yeah.
See, from the surgeon point of view, I think that audio feedback is instantaneous.
Yeah.
So you have to immediately drop whatever you are doing and make sure that you are not continue to do it further because you are now in the vicinity of the nerve, rightly or wrongly. So we can repeat that after some time to check whether it's triggering the EMG again, raw EMG is coming up again. And if it is a continuous firing going on for a long period of time, it's better to stop your dissection till that firing stops. And then you can use the same standard practice that we used to do, like cold irrigation or in case you think there is a vascular injury or something, you can use papaverine, or you stop the dissection, or you go somewhere else. You change your surgical strategy, thin out the tumor some more and come back again to this spot after some time. Resting the nerve after a raw EMG firing is very critical to preserve functionality of the nerve. Otherwise, the nerve can lose function even though it is anatomically continuous.
Any specified time for the rest time, sir?
At least 5 minutes. Probably you go and then come back again so that there is no further stimulation, because we have seen quite often that patients land up with significant deficit if we don't pay heed to that firing which happens because of handling. I don't think there is a critical time mentioned, but then it's good to stop doing whatever you're doing, allow it to assume a flat line, and then come back again after a few minutes.
Yeah. Okay, sir. And a question regarding the stimulators. So why do we prefer bipolar stimulator for cranial monitoring?
I think the answer is monopolar is very diffuse. So if you're finding something, you need to use monopolar. If you already know there is a cranial nerve, you can see the cranial nerve. it's better to use bipolar because you're limiting the current. You don't need to stimulate other structures around. You need to be very, very specific. You can come down on current and exactly identify the cranial nerves. So our approach would be initially start with monopolar and then come to bipolar when you see a cranial nerve, and then come down on the current. So we go as low as maybe 0.5, 0.2 also sometimes.
Yeah. And another question. So how feasible is corticobulbar MEP monitoring? Because there are lots of artifacts and it's technically challenging. Some feel that it's quite technically challenging.
Yeah, I think the answer is in the preoperative assessment of the patient. So if a patient is fully preserved, I think we will get good corticobulbar MEPs. The stimulation parameters what I have discussed. The idea is to give a train and then give an interstimulus interval and then give a short stimulus and then filter out the peripheral responses and catch only the central responses. So it is sometimes it becomes challenging. I know that sometimes it doesn't turn up the way we want it to, but we have to try to do it. That is what I want to emphasize, that we have to move on from only cranial nerve EMG, triggered EMG, and then move on to this where we start doing more and more of corticobulbar MEP. Because many times the surgeon wants the input as to whether the integrity of the pathways is there or not. So I think MEPs only will tell us about that.
See, the point I want to make here about corticobulbar MEPs and MEP or SSEP triggered through the cranial nerve is important because wherever we are stimulating or wherever we are having a raw EMG, we are only looking at the point of continuity from that point of contact. We don't know what is the continuity before that point of contact. So most often we see the nerve in the cistern, but we might have damaged the nerve at the root entry zone or where it's exiting from the brainstem. And then even though everything has been good, post-op patient will still wake up with palsy, and then no point being upset that that neurophysiology monitoring was inaccurate. We did not stimulate at the right spot. It is definitely continuous distally, but is it continuous proximally? That information we can have only if we complete the loop. So that is where this reflex testing, evoke potential monitoring through transcranial stimulation is gaining more traction, and that can be done in a continuous manner. So it will tell you whether any mistake is happening as you are operating, not only when you're stimulating. So that's very critical information that we need.
Yes, sir, that's rightly said. And what is the use of electrocochleography? Can it be used along with BERA?
I have no clue about it. I have not used it. I think the cochlear, the BERA, I think if you have an intact hearing, we look at BERA, and like I said, we look at the wave 1 and 2 and look for again latency of 5 also. But electrocochleography, I am not. I don't know.
Electrocochleography, as far as I know, is more important for cochlear integrity alone. Means, of course, it will complete the loop for you, but there is more information that you get whether the cochlea is intact or not. Like you have CC index, short sensitivity increment index, or recruitment. Those are phenomenon that cochleography gives to tell you whether the deafness is cochlear or retrocochlear. But when you want the loop, I think BERA is very good because it tells you the periphery to the center, completing the cortex. So it involves all the levels of the loop. So if the brainstem is disturbed, then the loop will be gone, and your BERA latency, based on the latency, you can say which part of the loop is affected. So I think that's why probably BERA is more.
Yes, sir. So I think electrocochleography will become a diagnostic modality. Rather than that, what we want is monitoring modality, which is BERA.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yes. Thanks for that. And how long BERA needs to be monitored? Do we have to monitor it till the skin closure time? Like, is there any specified time that it has to be monitored so that we don't miss out on deficits?
Exactly. There is no harm in monitoring until the end. BERA doesn't require any much stimulation, no change in anesthesia. So why to stop it? Even if there is a hematoma on the brainstem or something, you can catch it. So why not continue it until the end? I think BERA you can keep continuing to do until then. There is no, need to stop it.
Okay. Then for what are the EEG montages to be used to get the best monitoring for vascular surgery or EEG spectra?
It depends on the area of or the vascular structure involved. So if you're doing MCA territory or ICA territory, we use the normal C3, C4. Okay, that is what we want. if you're doing, medially,
Yeah.
I mean, if you're doing your lower limb, your ACA territory or ACOM aneurysm, you can do lower limb SSCP, you can do medial this thing. So you can do, CZ, CZFZ. So that is what we generally do. So it depends on what vascular structure is involved. So if you're doing posterior circulation like basilar, you have to add probably a SSCP MEP, and you have to do a BER also to do ischemia monitoring.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, that's I think many questions have flowed down while we were discussing, which I have also not observed. So I'll take a break, and I think there is a poll that is in progress.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else that you want to add, Dr. Nitin?
Ankit, are you there?
Yeah. So hi. So I think
just
if the
asked for
questions, yeah.
We had asked for a poll as to what modalities people are doing regularly, just to understand how the modalities are being used. And second thing
Right.
was also about the COVID era. Do you know the guidelines or for IONM with COVID? Because there are a lot of implications for IONM also. So Ankit, do you have the results with you?
So I think participation is a little less.
Okay.
But I think we can still, so results are there. Should we share the result, or you just want to observe?
We can wait for some, I'll make a comment. I think I saw a question about somebody asking what is the most critical point of resection where there is most probability of injuring the seventh nerve in spite of doing continuous monitoring. So I think surgically the most difficult part of the seventh nerve preservation is before identifying it. Once you have identified it, then you can be as gentle and as careful as you are, and you can go by the raw EMG, making sure that the rod doesn't fire as you are dissecting the nerve. So till you identify the nerve, you could have damaged it even before you know. So that is where probably it is very important to be very careful, suspect every fiber that you think as a nerve, as a seventh nerve, either towards the brainstem or towards the meatus, because we still don't know which part we are. And as you're thinning out the capsule, try to stimulate within the capsule with a higher current, like 10 milliampere or 5 milliampere, and see if you can identify the nerve before you are going to come across the nerve. So I think in my mind, probably I trouble Nitin maximum till seventh nerve is identified, and probably it's one of the most testing times for him also, because wherever I stimulate, he'll say seventh nerve is firing. I'll say, come on, I'm at the lower pole, it cannot be seventh nerve. So we would have identified at least 5 seventh nerves before we finally identify the correct seventh nerve. So it is tough, it is difficult, but then unless your sensitivity to identify seventh nerve threshold is very, very, very low, you may already damage the nerve even if you are monitoring it very well.
Yeah, that's a nice point, Dr. Anand. And there is one more question. So how do we make out whether it's a vessel injury or a cranial nerve injury? How does the vessel injuries impact the cranial nerve monitoring? Vascular injuries.
Usually vascular injuries tend to manifest little later, the ischemia effect, and maybe little delayed. So it may not immediately affect your conduction of nerve. I'm not sure about the physiology of it. Unlike SSCP, which is supposed to be very sensitive for vascular injuries, I don't know about peripheral nerves, whether peripheral nerves, the nerve conduction will be more intact till the vascular injury is manifested. But we do know for sure that if you identify the nerve, make sure that you don't dissect the arachnoid around the nerve so much that the vessel may go into spasm or vessel may get peeled off. Just like you would respect the covering in the optic nerve, it's best to preserve as much as possible of the layers of the nerve when you are dissecting it free of the nerve. So not good to have a naked nerve, better to have the nerve with its covering of arachnoid as much as possible. And then use papaverine if you want, if you find any changes that's happening, to prevent any ischemic damage from happening to the nerve. The problem about ischemic damage is that it can happen even post-operative period. There could be a retrograde thrombosis. You might have coagulated a vessel, a branch, which might go through retrograde thrombosis and affect the nerve function later. So better I avoid using bipolar cautery also anywhere near the nerve. Any amount of bleeding around the nerve, near the nerve, just manage it with gentle hemostatic agents like fibrillar, gel foam, So mild pressure and so on and so forth, and try to avoid cautery to the maximum.
Yes, sir. So there's another question regarding whatever you're telling now. So
Yeah.
do you use cautery for resection or CUSA? Because cautery might damage seventh nerve in an instant. It damages nerves quickly. Yeah.
Correct. So not only damage, it may also keep disturbing your potential. See, you will get firing because of the bipolar stimulation. So even though bipolar doesn't radiate much, we have seen bipolar electrical interference signal being very high. So it may interfere with your raw EMG and it may mislead you. So inside the tumor, within the tumor, we use CUSA maximum. Any bleeding within the tumor, unless it's a major spurter, we don't use any coagulation. We just use only cotton packing, wait, and then proceed. So avoid as much as possible any cauterization that's required.
Yes, sir. And how to reduce bone transmission while doing transcranial NEP for facial or trigeminal nerve? I think it's the question is how to reduce the impedance.
Yeah. So what is the question? To
How
reduce?
to reduce bone transmission while doing?
Yeah, that is basically for facial or corticobulbar MEP. That's what we use. We use interstimulus interval. We again stimulate after a train. So that differentiates whether it's a direct spread or whether it's a central response. So that is how we do for all the corticobulbar, corticofacial, all the MEPs. Cranial nerve MEPs especially.
Yeah.
I think Dr. Lakshmi will just wrap up with the question because there's another topic on which we would like Dr. Nitin to speak up. Before that topic starts, I would like to announce the result of the polls. I'm sure everyone would have seen because it was highlighted to everyone. So for the first question, that what is the common modality everyone uses for vestibular schwannoma? I think 90% people say the triggered EMG, which is the most common thing, and followed by the brain stem auditory evoked potential. And the second question, based on which the next topic Dr. Nitin will speak on, is if people are aware of COVID implications in IONM and are they taking precautions? So 70% people said yes. And I think this is very important for this time because living with COVID-19 is a new normal for all of us. And we should understand what are the challenges and how we can take care of it. So over to you, Dr. Nitin, please go ahead.
So we are faced with this situation here where, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, yes.
So I think there have been a lot of guidelines for surgery, for anesthesia, for everything. But I think IONM, I think I wanted this to be emphasized because there are many technicians here who work around in the theater. You know, they have to also be knowing what are the guidelines, how to protect yourself during this time. So this is the recommendations that has been given from American Clinical Neurophysiology Society. So this is the ACNS guidelines. And what they have said is for the technologist or the IONM personnel, first thing is you need to be trained. So you need to know how to don and doff a PPE, what are the components of a PPE, what are the levels of PPE, okay, how to wear it. The most important thing is more than wearing it, how to remove it and still be safe, even though you have done a COVID positive case. So in the future, maybe we'll have to do surgeries on COVID positive patients also. So we need to prepare and train ourselves now. Second thing is maintain social distancing inside the theater, minimize the IONM staff inside the OT. I think we need to now consider a possibility of remote monitoring, not remote monitoring in the sense sit somewhere else and do monitoring, but maybe, you know, go as far as possible from the surgical field, have long wires, you know, be on the other end of the theater, not close to the surgical field, because your equipment also might get, you know, contaminated by aerosols. And always look at the patients, ask the people around whether the patient is a suspect or a COVID positive, and then inquire about that. The N95 and everything, I think most of you know, but you need to again train yourself. And PPE also, what the institution tells. So level 1, level 2, level 3, I think most institutes follow this. So if you have a positive or a suspect patient, you should follow the utmost level 3 PPE for protection. Also very important is equipment should be protected. So these equipment, because we move these equipment from theater to theater, and we also use the simulators and the equipment from one patient to another, we should not make it transmitters for COVID. So what we need to do is after every case, you should use a antiseptic wipe to clean all the surfaces on the IONM equipment. Also, just like how you cover your microscope, with plastic covers and sheets, you should cover your INM equipment with plastic cover. Every day, you should wipe it with 70% alcohol or disinfecting wipe solutions or wipes. And you should also use disposable electrodes as and when feasible. But if you cannot use disposable electrodes for all cases, what you need to do is the electrodes should be disinfected with at least 70% alcohol or diluted bleach solution. So 70% alcohol is most likely what we use in our theater, like the hand rub or the sterilium. So that can be used for sterilizing all the equipment, the DAC boxes, the wires, everything, the corkscrews, everything should be sterilized. And then you can send it to ETO. ETO doesn't kill the virus. So you need to first sterilize it for the virus by using this antiseptics and then send it for the ETO. So this is how you can prevent transmission from the equipment also. You need to protect yourself and you need to protect the equipment. So this is something which I wanted to stress on. The American Clinical Neurophysiology Society guidelines is available online. You can go through it. It's available and it's latest updated just. Ankit, so stay safe and maybe we shall overcome.
Thanks a lot, sir. It was, I think this is very, very important for everyone, whoever is there in the call and they do regular INM. And since, as Dr. Anand was discussing in the beginning, now everyone has started doing even the elective surgeries. So I'm sure all of you will be going more and more. So it's important to be safe. Although lockdown is over, but the coronavirus stays. So we have to be careful and we have to continue moving forward. So thanks a lot, Dr. Anand. Thanks a lot, Dr. Nitin. I think there was so many appreciations in the chat boxes, and it was really wonderful lecture. I still feel few questions left out, but I think it's okay. We'll get back to them, and I will also get back to people with the research articles which Dr. Nitin has asked. He will share. And also thanks a lot to Dr. Lakshmi for moderating this session. I think we really like the way you take the questions and answer so many from your side as well. So thanks everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you, Anand sir. Thank you, Nitin sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.